Welcome back, friends. Tonight we peel back centuries of silence to ask, is that the Vatican's greatest covery up the so-called Dark Ages? In the shadows of crumbling empires and whispered councils, faith and power intersected in ways both breathtaking and brutal. We'll wander through candlelit scriptoria, buried archives, and forgotten synods where truths were preserved, altered, or erased. Don't let the grandeur of cathedrals blind you. Behind their soaring arches lay politics, secrets, and struggles for control. If you're drawn to these hidden chapters of our past, please give this video a like and subscribe only if it feels right for you. I'd love to know where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world, so drop a comment below. Now, soften the lights. Let a hush settle in the room, and allow yourself to drift into a story woven from devotion and deception. Let's uncover what history tried to hide. In 476 CE, the young Roman Emperor Romulus Augustulus was deposed, marking what many historians regard as the fall of the Western Roman Empire and the dawn of an era often labeled the Dark Ages. Yet this phrase obscures a more complex reality. While imperial authority crumbled beneath mounting barbarian incursions, the Bishop of Rome was asserting a different kind of power. Bishop Leo I, who had famously met with Attila the Hun in 452 CE and persuaded him to spare the city, now guided a flock adrift without secular protection. In the decades that followed, successive pontiffs assumed not only spiritual leadership, but also became de facto arbiters of stability, negotiating with Gothic, Lombard, and Frankish rulers to safeguard what remained of Roman heritage. Monasteries sprang up as islands of learning in a sea of upheaval, preserving classical texts even as Latin dialects fractured and trade networks faltered. Artisans continued to craft illuminated manuscripts, and local councils met to reconcile fading pagan traditions with the demands of orthodoxy. Far from being a uniform descent into ignorance, this time was marked by a fierce struggle to redefine authority under the shadow of Rome's former grandeur. As we begin our journey through the Church's subtle reshaping of history, consider how much of what we know today may rest on decisions made in candlelit basilicas more than on battlefield victories. After the deposition of Romulus Augustulus in 476 CE, Italy fractured into competing kingdoms ruled by Ostrogoths, Byzantines, and Lombards. Yet the papacy in Rome steadily filled the void left by imperial collapse. Pope Gelasius I, who reigned from 492 to 496 CE, articulated a doctrine distinguishing spiritual authority from secular power in his famous letter to Emperor Anastasius, arguing that priests held the greater power of the soul, while emperors governed the body. This concept cemented the Church's dual role and legitimized its interventions in political affairs. Meanwhile, Gregory the Great, Pope from 590 to 604 CE, dispatched missionaries, such as Augustine of Canterbury, to convert Anglo-Saxon England, extending Rome's influence through faith rather than force. Monastic communities, inspired by Benedict's rule, became centers of agricultural innovation and manuscript preservation across Europe, ensuring that works by Cicero, Virgil, and Galen survived the turmoil. At the same time, the Lombard invasions of 568 CE forced the papacy to negotiate treaties that granted it temporal control over the Duchy of Rome, laying groundwork for the later Papal States. In each diplomatic endeavor, whether gifting gold to Arian kings or anointing Frankish rulers, the Church shaped the emerging medieval order. Far from passive observers, popes guided succession disputes and brokered peace, molding Europe's political geography. This blending of sanctity and strategy created a selective record, victories attributed to divine favor, and defeats downplayed or recast. As we trace these moments, we begin to see how the narrative of a stagnant Dark Age obscures a vibrant transformation driven from within Vatican walls. In the quiet cloisters of early medieval Europe, Benedictine monasteries became sanctuaries for knowledge at risk of vanishing. Monks in Cassiodorus's vivarium in southern Italy established the first organized scriptoria around 540 CE, where each parchment was carefully scraped and ruled before a scribe set to work with a quill. These communities did more than simply copy sacred texts. They selected works of classical authors deemed compatible with Christian teaching, preserving Virgil's poetry and Cicero's letters alongside copies of Augustine's Confessions. Yet other writings, philosophies of Seneca or the treatises of Galen were neglected or omitted entirely, deeming them too pagan or medically dangerous. The famous scriptorium at Monte Cassino, founded by Benedict himself, followed this pattern. Records show that by the late 7th century, monks there had produced illuminated gospel books with intricate initial letters and marginal annotations, while secular histories survived only when they served the Church's narrative. Libraries in Irish monasteries, such as those at Clonmacnoise and Skellig Michael, further expanded this preservation, but also introduced local glosses that reflected regional concerns. Through these isolated enclaves, a patchwork of classical learning endured, but the gaps became as telling as the texts that survived. What passed through these cellars of scholarship shaped our view of antiquity, while the voices left unrecorded were lost to silence. As you ponder the unseen choices behind which manuscripts reached our modern libraries and which were left to rot, consider how these monks wielded power over history by wielding a simple pen. In the wake of Rome's retreat, Gothic and Vandal kingdoms rose across former imperial lands, and with them came church emissaries determined to spread orthodoxy and, at times, reshape history. In the early 6th century, Pope Gregory the Great commissioned bishops to evangelize the Ostrogoths in Italy, despite their Arian beliefs. As these missions unfolded, local chronicles were frequently revised to emphasize Roman unity under the one true faith. The Vandals who controlled North Africa faced similar pressure after the Byzantine reconquest in 534 CE, when pro-Nicene clerics rewritten accounts to portray earlier Vandal rule as heretical tyranny, casting indigenous customs in a darker light. In Gaul, Gallo-Roman records were edited to elevate Frankish chieftains as pious defenders of the Church, while Gothic rulers who had once been allies were quietly downplayed. Manuscripts from Merovingian scriptoria survive today, with marginal notes praising King Clovis's baptism in 496 CE as the moment when barbarian darkness gave way to Christian illumination and interpretation, absent from sources closer to the events. Meanwhile, in Spain, the Third Council of Toledo, in 589 CE, not only converted the Visigothic king Reccared, but also sanctioned the expunging of Arian texts and the rewriting of regional hagiographies to legitimize the Catholic lineage. Through these edits, the Church crafted a seamless narrative of conquest by conversion rather than by force, obscuring the negotiated compromises and regional variances that characterized early medieval faith. The ink of these scribes flowed over the diversity of belief, replacing it with a more uniform vision of Christendom of vision that continues to shape our understanding of those turbulent centuries. Amid the ragged ruins of former libraries, the vanishing of classical scholars became one of the era's greatest mysteries. In the 6th and 7th centuries, barely a trace remained of Neoplatonists in Alexandria or the medical schools of Pergamum. Works by Hypatia, whose brutal murder in 415 CE symbolized the breakup of pagan learning, ceased to circulate, and the treatises of Galen were available only through abridged versions vetted by clerical authorities. Byzantine scholars, like John Philoponus, preserved commentaries on Aristotle, but these survived in isolated codices rather than in widespread circulation. In the West, the once celebrated philosophers of Athanasius of Alexandria, or the eclectic syncretism of Boethius, dwindled to footnotes in hagiographical texts. When documents resurfaced centuries later in monastic collections, they bore the marks of redaction, passages cut, names altered, entire sections recontextualized to align with emerging church orthodoxy. The disappearance was not accidental. Councils and synods intermittently condemned pagan wisdom as a spiritual threat, discouraging its study. Monks entrusted with preserving sacred writings often saw secular philosophies as distractions from divine truth. Consequently, while theological treatises multiplied, secular histories and scientific inquiries receded into obscurity. This deliberate pruning reshaped Europe's intellectual landscape, creating gaps that centuries of later scholars would struggle to bridge. As we consider the lost dialogues of thinkers whose voices were silenced, it becomes clear that the history of ideas in the early Middle Ages was as much about what was erased as what was recorded. Well before cathedral schools rose to prominence in the 10th and 11th centuries, clandestine circles of scholars kept classical learning alive beyond the watchful eyes of Rome. In the 7th and 8th centuries, Irish and Scottish monks established remote monastic foundations on windswept islands, such as Iona and Skellig Michael, where they not only copied gospel texts, but also preserved secular works by Boethius and Prudentius. These peripatetic scholars carried small libraries in chests bound in leather, hiding them within caves when Viking raiders threatened. Farther east, in Byzantine Armenia, secret schools taught the philosophies of Plato and Plotinus in private chambers, passing manuscripts in Greek and Syriac that the Patriarchate in Constantinople deemed too risky for general circulation. In Lombard Italy, lay scholars gathered in private villas under the patronage of nobles who prized pagan poetry and rhetoric, hosting evening recitations that blended Homeric verses with Latin elegies. These gatherings were never recorded in official annals. Their survival depended entirely on word of mouth and coded marginalia in surviving texts. Even within established monasteries, certain texts were chained to lecterns and made available only to those who took additional vows of secrecy, ensuring that advanced mathematics or astronomical treatises remained hidden from casual readers. This undercurrent of independent inquiry created a parallel intellectual network that defied the emerging orthodoxy's restrictions. The knowledge nurtured in these hidden schools would later seed the Carolingian Renaissance and shape the curricula of burgeoning cathedral schools. Yet because much of it remained undocumented or deliberately concealed, these centers of learning exist today as tantalizing footnotes. Their very existence hints at a deeper complexity beneath the veneer of a monolithic medieval church. In the mid-8th century, a document emerged that would profoundly reshape the church's claim to secular power, the Donation of Constantine. Purportedly written by Emperor Constantine I after his conversion, it granted the bishop of Rome dominion over Rome and the western provinces, establishing the foundation for papal temporal authority. For centuries, medieval popes and their legal teams relied on this text to justify interventions in political disputes and to demand fealty from kings. Yet by the Renaissance, humanist scholars began to question its authenticity. Lorenzo Valla, in the 1440s, employed philological analysis to demonstrate that the Latin style and theological concepts reflected a much later era, likely the 8th or 9th century, not the early 4th. He showed that references to the city of Constantinople and to ecclesiastical structures did not align with Constantine's lifetime. Despite Valla's findings, the donation remained influential in political theology long after it was exposed as a forgery. It had already been woven into the fabric of church law, cited at councils, and displayed in illuminated manuscripts as irrefutable proof of divine favor. The impact of this deception cannot be overstated. Popes used it to crown emperors and to claim the right to adjudicate imperial disputes. Even after its unmasking, successors continued to invoke its spirit, if not its letter. The episode reveals how a carefully crafted text, embraced without scrutiny, can endure as a linchpin of institutional power. As we reflect on the donation's shadowy origins and long-lasting influence, we must ask how many other foundational texts have been accepted at face value, and how much of history depends on documents whose provenance remains uncertain. By the end of the 8th century, the Vatican Scriptoria had finalized a canon of 27 books of the New Testament, yet countless other Gospels and writings existed quietly on the margins. These apocryphal works recounted alternative visions of Christ's teachings and detailed the lives of saints in ways that sometimes contradicted official doctrine. Manuscripts such as the Gospel of Thomas or the Infancy Gospel of James were copied in monasteries, but never included in the sanctioned canon. Instead, they were gradually expunged from storage rooms and chained corridors, deemed heretical or too discordant with evolving orthodoxy. Letters between church leaders from North Africa and Rome describe orders to destroy these texts or to burn suspect pages, while marginal notes in surviving codices hint at deliberate erasures. In some cases, scribes scraped away entire passages, leaving behind faint palimpsests that modern scholars have only recently begun to recover. The motives were manifold: controlling theological debate, eliminating alternative narratives about Christ's birth and resurrection, and reinforcing a unified message that bolstered papal authority. Yet the loss came at a cost. Doctrinal debates in the 4th and 5th centuries had hinged on nuanced Christologies drawn from these very texts, and without their broader context, later theologians faced thicker walls between dogma and discovery. Today, fragments of these hidden Gospels appear in museum collections or in the Nag Hammadi library, offering tantalizing glimpses of early Christian diversity. Their recovery challenges us to reconsider how a closed canon shaped centuries of belief, and how many voices were silenced to present a singular account of faith. In the labyrinth beneath Rome's streets, hidden gatherings shaped doctrine far from public view. As the city's marble basilicas gleamed in daylight, secret synods convened in the catacombs, and private oratories to resolve controversies too delicate for open debate. Around 692 CE, during what later historians called the Quinisext Council, bishops sympathetic to Eastern rites met clandestinely to discuss clerical marriage and the use of leavened bread in the Eucharist. Their conclusions were carried in sealed letters to Pope Sergius I, who faced pressure from both Byzantine and Frankish interests, but never fully disclosed the deliberations. Earlier, in 649 CE, a council in Rome condemned monothelitism, the belief that Christ possessed only a single will, yet records of the debate survive only in fragments copied by loyal scribes who omitted dissenting voices. Monastic chroniclers referred obliquely to meetings of the faithful, held in undisclosed locations, suggesting that cardinals and abbots exchanged arguments away from imperial scrutiny. These covert meetings were essential for maintaining unity in an age of theological fragmentation, but they also excluded local clergy and lay theologians, leaving entire regions unaware of crucial doctrinal shifts. By the time official acts were promulgated, much had already been decided in corridors lit by flickering oil lamps, where loyalty to Rome outweighed transparency. Modern scholars have pieced together these lost proceedings through marginalia and cross-referenced letters, yet significant gaps remain. What uncertainties linger about the Church's foundational beliefs because they were hammered out in secrecy? As we reflect on the power wielded in these hidden chambers, consider how many teachings reached the masses after first passing through hushed consensus among a select few. By the early 9th century, the veneration of relics had become central to medieval piety and central to the papacy's growing influence. Bones, fragments of cloth, and objects said to have touched saints were displayed in ornate reliquaries, drawing pilgrims from across Christendom. Yet the authenticity of many items was questionable, and evidence suggests that forgeries proliferated to meet insatiable demand. In 835 CE, Aldrich of Le Mans wrote to Pope Gregory IV expressing concern that merchants in Aachen sold dubious pieces of the true cross alongside other sacred treasures, each accompanied by dubious certificates of authenticity. Similar complaints arose in Rome, where Inspectio Ingin of relics sometimes revealed mismatched bone fragments and seals from multiple era signs that collectors had swapped genuine items for fakes. Despite these warnings, the papal chancery often endorsed questionable relics if their presence promised increased tithes and pilgrimage revenue. Reliquaries, bearing the names of obscure martyrs, were quietly upgraded in official catalogues when their guardians paid homage to Rome. In some cases, bones excavated from catacombs were rebranded with new saints' names to satisfy local devotion, then licensed by papal decree. Contemporary hagiographers rarely mentioned controversies, preferring miraculous tales of healing and divine intervention. Only in the synodal records of the 11th century do sporadic references appear, condemning unauthorized vendors and ordering bishops to verify relics before public display. Yet by then, the reputation of Rome's holy treasury was firmly established. Pilgrims remained unfazed by rumors of fraud, believing that miracles outweighed provenance. This chapter of economic and spiritual enterprise reveals how the Church's need for revenue and prestige fueled a marketplace where the sacred and the suspect coexisted, leaving later historians to sift truth from trade. In 541 CE, waves of plague swept across the Mediterranean, decimating populations and unsettling established authority. As physicians grappled with limited medical knowledge, the Church offered explanations that intertwined divine will with earthly misfortune. Pope Gregory the Great, writing around 590 CE, described the outbreak in Rome as a judgment against sin, but also shepherded relief efforts, organizing grain distributions, and ordering processions to appeal for divine mercy. However, medical treatises by contemporaries like Paul of Aegina, who documented symptoms and treatments in the 7th century, were seldom translated into Latin or widely circulated in the West. Regarded with suspicion as remnants of pagan wisdom, monastic infirmaries often adhered strictly to spiritual remedies prayers, relic veneration, and fasting while discouraging empirical approaches deemed irreverent. When the plague receded, affected regions erected shrines to martyrs believed to have interceded, reinforcing the notion that disease was primarily a spiritual trial. Over time, ecclesiastical authorities maintained tight control over medical knowledge, codifying rules that labeled unconventional healers as potential heretics. Women practicing herbal medicine, or midwifery in particular, faced accusations of witchcraft if their methods fell outside sanctioned norms. By the onset of the 8th century, local councils passed canons forbidding clergy from consulting secular physicians or employing non-Christian remedies, effectively marginalizing medical discourse, not aligned with church doctrine. This fusion of faith and medicine shaped medieval public health, limiting the transmission of anatomical and botanical knowledge for centuries. As modern research recovers lost manuscripts on early medical practice, we gain a clearer view of what was suppressed what competitions between belief and biology cost countless lives. In 726 CE, Emperor Leo III issued edicts against the veneration of religious images, igniting the first period of Byzantine iconoclasm that reverberated throughout Christendom for over a century. These decrees forbade the use of icons in worship and ordered the removal and destruction of sacred paintings and mosaics, arguing that any representation of Christ or the saints risked idolatry. While the dispute began in the Eastern Empire, its repercussions reached Rome, where Pope Gregory II, and later Gregory III, fiercely opposed imperial policy. In response, Italian bishops convened synods in 731 CE and 732 CE, condemning iconoclasm as heresy and affirming the theological necessity of images for instructing the faithful. Despite papal protests, local authorities in parts of Lombard Italy enforced iconoclastic measures, leading to clandestine efforts by monks and artisans to preserve sacred artworks. Manuscripts from Monte Cassino and Bobbio reveal hidden illustrations painstakingly copied under dim candlelight, their margins bearing coded prayers for protection. In 787 CE, the Second Council of Nicaea restored icon veneration, yet a second iconoclastic wave under Emperor Leo V between 815 CE and 843 CE again endangered Christian art. Throughout these conflicts, the papacy's stance evolved from moral opposition to political maneuvering, leveraging support from Frankish kings like Charles the Bald to bolster its defense of icons. This alliance ultimately contributed to the Carolingian endorsement of religious imagery in the West, shaping Roman and Frankish artistic traditions alike. The deliberate destruction and subsequent restoration of icons not only reflected deep theological divides, but also demonstrated how the Church's engagement in doctrinal battles could erase or resurrect entire bodies of visual culture. As we consider the scars left on cathedral walls and illuminated scrolls, we glimpse the extent to which iconoclasm served both as a tool of imperial control and a catalyst for papal assertion. Take a breath. We've only scratched the surface. Subscribe to keep uncovering what's hidden. In the early 9th century, under Charlemagne's grand reforms, accusations of sorcery began surfacing among those who strayed from sanctioned religious practice. Church councils, notably the Council of Paderborn in 785 CE, condemned pagan customs but stopped short of labeling them witchcraft. Still, by the time the Canon Episcopi circulated around 906 CE, the Church had drawn a clearer line. Any claim of nocturnal flights or shape-shifting was dismissed as the work of malevolent spirits deceiving vulnerable minds. Clergy who preached too freely about visions or miracles risked suspicion, and women healers or midwives custodians of herbal lore found themselves particularly vulnerable to denunciation. Local bishops recorded trials where unlicensed practitioners faced penance or exile, their remedies and charms burned as proof of devilish collusion. Across the Frankish realms, synodal decrees urged the laity to report unorthodox rituals, and when reports reached Rome, the papal chancery sometimes issued stern letters ordering the suppression of folk traditions. By the 10th century, monasteries housed secret collections on demonology and exorcism, instructing select monks in techniques to combat witchcraft. Yet these same libraries often rejected pragmatic medical texts, deepening the divide between sanctioned faith and folk belief. The seeds sown in these formative centuries would later blossom into the pervasive witch hunts of the late medieval period, but here, in the Church's earliest efforts to police the supernatural, we glimpse the origin of a campaign that conflated healing arts with heresy. As we reflect on how accusations of witchcraft gained theological legitimacy, Consider how easily fear and authority merge to silence entire communities under the guise of spiritual protection. Beneath the opulent facade of St. Peter's and the Vatican palaces, secret vaults and hidden archives lay beyond the reach of most clergy. As early as the late 8th century, records speak of restricted chambers where sensitive correspondence, legal judgments, and diplomatic treaties were stored under multiple locks. One account, from the reign of Pope Hadrian I, around 780 CE, notes that letters from Frankish kings and Byzantine emperors were kept in a subterranean repository, accessible only to the pontiff and his closest advisors. Over time, this clandestine collection grew to include personal dossiers on influential nobles, detailed inventories of relics whose provenance was suspect, and minutes from private synods never disclosed to the broader episcopal community. Monastic chroniclers occasionally hinted at books bound in secrecy that contained accounts embarrassing to Rome cases of clerical misconduct, disputed apostolic privileges, and the delicate terms of treaties negotiated far from public scrutiny. By the 10th century, construction of new corridors beneath the Lateran Palace provided additional hidden space, ensuring that certain documents remained shielded from inquisitive eyes. Attempts by secular rulers to audit these archives were routinely rebuffed, leading to whispered rumors that the Church's true history resided not in public libraries, but in locked scrolls and codices. Modern scholars have unearthed fragments of these concealed texts in private collections and reused parchment, but much remains lost. The existence of these vaults underscores a deliberate strategy. By controlling access to key documents, the Vatican could shape collective memory and manage political leverage. As we contemplate the weight of unexamined records buried for centuries, we confront the unsettling truth that the most consequential pages of history may still lie hidden beneath Rome's marble floors. In December of 800 CE, on Christmas Day, in the Basilica of St. Peter, Pope Leo III placed a golden crown upon the head of Charlemagnean Act that reverberated across Europe and redefined the balance of power between church and state. This coronation revived the title of Emperor of the Romans in the West, long after the fall of Constantinople's influence, and established a precedent for papal authority to grant imperial legitimacy. The alliance benefited both parties. Charlemagne gained sacral prestige to unify his diverse realms, while the pontiff secured a protector against Lombard aggression and potential Byzantine interference. Yet, the symbolic act carried deeper implications. By bestowing the imperial diadem, Leo signaled that secular rule derived its ultimate sanction from the Church, not from hereditary succession or military conquest alone. Chroniclers in Aachen celebrated the moment as the dawn of a renewed Roman glory, emphasizing divine favor in the king's uplifted right hand and the archangelic choir said to accompany the ceremony. Meanwhile, Vatican records maintained in both Latin and the Frankish vernacular portrayed Leo's gesture as a restoration of Christian unity under one crown. What these accounts omit, however, are the negotiations in shadowed corridors, the quid pro quo of papal protection for Frankish patronage, the unspoken tensions over jurisdiction in Italian territories, and the subsequent disputes when Charlemagne's heirs pressed their own claims to spiritual endorsement. The crowning cemented a narrative in which the emperor ruled by virtue of papal blessing, a story that would endure even as later popes and monarchs contested its details. As we examine this defining moment, consider how ritual and record combined to elevate the papacy's political reach and influence that centuries of cover-ups and crafted chronicles would continue to bolster. Around the year 790 CE, Alcuin of York, an eminent scholar from Northumbria, arrived at Charlemagne's court in Aachen and took charge of royal schools and libraries. His influence extended beyond teaching. He exercised editorial control over the Annales Regni Francorum, the official chronicle of the Frankish realm. While the annals recorded events from 741 to 829 CE, Alcuin's revisions in the early 9th century subtly shaped the portrayal of Carolingian achievements. Passages praising Charlemagne's piety and military victories were expanded with theological interpretations, casting each conquest as a divinely ordained mission to defend the Church. Conversely, setbacks such as the Saxon uprisings from 782 to 785 CE that culminated in the massacre of Verdun were downplayed. The brutal suppression of 500 Saxons received only a terse mention, omitting the scale of violence that later sources would lament. Beyond the royal annals, Alcuin guided the compilation of hagiographies like the Vita Sancti Willibrordi, framing missionary work in Friesland as emblematic of Carolingian spiritual leadership while smoothing over conflicts between Frankish clergy and local populations. His correspondence reveals directives to monastic scriptoria to prioritize texts that reinforced unity between Rome and Aachen, marginalizing dissenting voices. By standardizing Latin usage and harmonizing historical narratives with doctrinal orthodoxy, Alcuin ensured that the written record emphasized divine favor upon the empire, reinforcing papal and imperial collaboration. These editorial choices demonstrate how scholarly authority within the church apparatus determined which facts reached posterity and which were consigned to silence. As we consider the enduring impact of Alcuin's hand upon Carolingian memory, we confront the power wielded by those who curate history's first drafts. When Crusader banners first appeared before Constantinople in April 1204, few anticipated the cultural devastation that would follow. Though the Fourth Crusade was intended to reclaim Jerusalem, political intrigue diverted it to the Byzantine capital. Over 3 furious days, Crusaders breached the Theodosian walls and ransacked imperial palaces. Among their spoils were the city's famed libraries' repositories of Hellenistic philosophy, medical treatises, and early Christian writings. Monks and lay scholars recorded panicked attempts to protect scrolls and codices by hiding them in monasteries on Mount Athos and remote Aegean islands, yet countless works disappeared into private hands or were shredded for bookbindings. Latin chroniclers, such as Geoffrey of Villehardouin, praised the pillage as a reward for Christendom. But Eastern authors like Nicetas Choniates lamented the irreparable loss of irreplaceable manuscripts. Remarkably, when news reached Rome, papal registers made scant mention of the intellectual toll. Instead, letters from Pope Innocent III focused on excommunications for crusaders who attacked fellow Christians, while glossing over the obliteration of Eastern heritage. The Vatican's silence on the library's fate reflected political calculations. The papacy sought to maintain the Crusades' momentum and support from Western nobility, even at the expense of acknowledging cultural carnage. It was not until centuries later that Western collectors attempted to trace scattered Byzantine texts, often discovering fragments in church treasuries across France and Italy. The story of Constantinople's lost libraries underscores how power and piety intertwined to prioritize conquest over preservation, leaving posterity to mourn what was never recorded or rescued. In the early 9th century, Charlemagne sought not only to unify his sprawling realm, but to harmonize worship across his dominions. He invited Roman clerics and singers to his court at Aachen, commissioning them to teach the liturgical chant of Rome. By 800 CE, papal envoys had brought with them a stylized form of chant, later known as Gregorian, which replaced a rich tapestry of local melodies in Frankish, Gallican, and Mozarabic churches. Monastic communities, once proud of their distinctive hymns and psalm tones, found their manuscripts overwritten with Roman antiphons. Councils such as those held at Aachen and Mainz issued directives mandating the use of the Roman Mass setting, while local bishops were instructed to surrender variant service books to be recopied in the standardized form. Scribes erased marginal notes and cross-references that reflected regional practice, and artisans melted down or destroyed musical notation scrolls deemed obsolete. The cultural cost was immense. Ancient plainsong traditions that had thrived since the late Roman era faded into oblivion, their contours lost whenever a single cantor refused to carry the old tunes. By centralizing chant, the Church reinforced papal authority, but stifled musical diversity. In cathedral schools, students learned the new liturgy under strict supervision, with any deviation viewed as defiance of ecclesiastical unity. Only in remote monasteries or in regions beyond the empire's immediate control did remnants of pre-Roman chant survive, hidden in private collections or echoed in folk melodies. As modern musicologists reconstruct early medieval chant from fragments and palimpsests, they reveal how the drive for uniform worship underpinned a systematic silencing of local voice. While the Vatican tightened its grip on liturgy, independent trading cities on Europe's fringes developed a more open intellectual climate that stood in stark contrast to Rome's restrictive policies. In the 11th century, Venice emerged as a bustling hub linking east and west, its merchants negotiating with Byzantine officials and Muslim traders alike. Venetian libraries amassed Greek manuscripts, Arabic scientific treatises, and Jewish philosophical works, often acquired through purchase or diplomatic gift rather than copyist labor. Local church authorities tolerated this eclectic collection, recognizing that commerce and scholarship alike depended on broader horizons. In Pisa and Amalfi, cathedral archives preserved not only papal bulls but also records of maritime law and navigational manuals penned by seafarers who learned from Muslim counterparts in North Africa. These documents formed the basis of what would become the Ius Mercatorum, a body of commercial law that operated independently of canon law and allowed merchants to resolve disputes without ecclesiastical oversight. Meanwhile, secular rulers in Provence patronized translations of Avicenna's medical compendia and Ptolemy's astronomical texts, distributing them through civic institutions rather than monasteries. When church councils in Rome later attempted to regulate the importation of non-Latin works citing fears of theological contamination, Venetian and Provençal scholars found ways to circumvent restrictions by copying texts under pseudonymous titles or hiding them within legal codices. This spirited exchange of ideas fostered a vibrant scholastic culture that predated the universities of the 12th century and underscored a fundamental truth: where religion sought uniformity, commerce and civic pride championed diversity. The resilience of these secular centers reminds us that intellectual progress often thrives on the margins of centralized authority, and that the narrative of a uniform Dark Age overlooks the dynamic cross-cultural networks that quietly sustained Europe's revival. In the waning years of the 8th century, church authorities began orchestrating clandestine purges of texts deemed heretical or dangerous, consigning entire libraries to flames. One of the earliest recorded instances occurred at the Council of Macon in 581 CE, when bishops ordered the destruction of apocryphal gospels and lay manuals that strayed from approved doctrine. These burnings were not always public spectacles. Often, local abbots received secret instructions from Rome to gather suspect volumes under cover of night. In 789 CE, Charlemagne's Missi Dominici reported to the papal court that pagan runic inscriptions and so-called magical treatises persisted in the libraries of Frisian monasteries. Under papal pressure, these works were quietly seized and incinerated in courtyard pyres, their ashes buried beneath chapel floors. Centuries later, during the height of the Albigensian Crusade in 1000, 209, inquisitors compiled extensive inventories of Cathar scriptures texts, promoting dualistic theology, and systematically burned them in Modicide bonfires outside Toulouse. Not all destruction was immediately visible. Scribes scraped offending passages from parchment, repurposing the cleaned skins for new manuscripts, effectively erasing unwanted knowledge without a trace. Marginal notes in surviving codices hint at these erasures, with gaps in text and faded ghost letters marking lost chapters. Through these secretive campaigns, the Church curated its intellectual landscape by eliminating dissenting voices before they could spread. The resulting void deprived later generations of alternative moral and philosophical perspectives, leaving posterity to reconstruct what was lost only through fragmentary evidence. As we reflect on the silent violence wrought upon medieval libraries, we recognize a darker side of preservation. Sometimes the most decisive act of control comes not in what is saved, but in what is destroyed. By the dawn of the 9th century, the Vatican's scriptoria had evolved into vigilant gatekeepers, monitoring every marginal note and illustration before a manuscript could leave their walls. Monks assigned to these scriptoria followed strict directives. Any commentary that strayed into secular philosophy or represented regional folklore was to be redacted or excised entirely. Surviving colophons from abbeys in Reichenau and Fulda reveal that scribes routinely presented completed Bibles and canonical compilations to the papal legate for approval, waiting months while hidden errors were corrected. Letters exchanged between the abbots of St. Gall and the papal chancery in 820 CE discuss discrepancies over proper rubrication and admonish monks who dared include glosses on Cicero's rhetorical techniques. A rare memorandum from 827 CE instructs monks to remove diagrams illustrating the workings of the astrolabe from scientific treatises, classifying them as pagan contraptions that could mislead the faithful. Even innocuous map fragments, showing the extent of Roman roads, were sometimes deemed too evocative of a lost empire, and pasted over with liturgical charts instead. This micromanagement extended to the language itself. Latin orthography was standardized, and any script reflecting local dialects or Irish insular scripts was converted to Caroline minuscule without acknowledgement of its origins. Through these meticulous controls, the Vatican ensured that each manuscript conveyed not only sacred text, but also a uniform worldview, one unified under papal authority. The choices made in these hidden workshops shaped medieval knowledge, leaving modern scholars to piece together lost layers by studying palimpsests and the faint underdrawings of censored pages. In the late 9th and 10th centuries, as Islamic scholarship blossomed in Cordoba, Baghdad, and Cairo, the Vatican viewed the influx of Saracen learning with both fascination and suspicion. Spanish clerics brought back Arabic treatises on mathematics, medicine, and philosophy works by Al-Khwarizmi, Avicenna, and Averroes that challenged established European thought. Initially, these manuscripts circulated discreetly in the libraries of Mozarabic Christians under Umayyad rule, where scholars translated them into Latin. However, once these texts reached monastic centers north of the Pyrenees, church authorities intervened. Decrees from the Council of Tours in 813 CE and again in 847 CE forbade the copying of Islamic writings without explicit permission from Rome, branding them as sources of heretical error. Monastic librarians were instructed to submit any Arabic manuscripts to the papal chancery for vetting. Only those with overtly Christian commentary were granted clearance. One surviving memorandum from the Abbey of Fleury circa 920 CE laments that medical texts by Rhazes were chained in secluded chambers, accessible only to a handful of monks deemed trustworthy. Meanwhile, Philosophical works expounding Aristotelian logic were introduced to Europe via Arabic intermediaries, were revised to include prefatory warnings about their potential dangers to faith. Despite these restrictions, a clandestine network of scholars persisted, copying texts by night and sharing them in coded correspondence. These hidden exchanges laid the groundwork for the translation movement of the 12th century, when cathedral schools eagerly embraced Arabic science. Yet, because early translations were often censored and footnotes excised, subtleties in Saracen thought were lost or misrepresented. This chapter of filtered transmission underscores how the Vatican's desire to control theological purity delayed Europe's engagement with critical advances made in the Islamic world, even as it inadvertently planted seeds for the coming intellectual revival. In the dawn of the 11th century, dissenting voices emerged within Christendom, yet the Vatican moved swiftly to silence any doctrinal deviation. Figures like Gottschalk of Orbaishu in the 840s CE championed a rigorous, predestinarian theology, found their writings condemned as heretical. Councils convened in Mainz in 848 CE declared his teachings an affront to church unity, and subsequent editions of theological compendia excised his name entirely, replacing it with vague references to unnamed errors. Meanwhile, itinerant preachers preaching reform in Catalonia and Aquitaine circulated treatises criticizing clerical wealth and urging a return to apostolic poverty. These manuscripts were seized by local bishops and delivered to Rome, where papal legates ordered their destruction. What survived did so only through secret networks. Lay sympathizers concealed fragments in missals and devotional booklets, hiding them under altar slabs and within hollowed prayer beads. By the mid-11th century, the Vatican had established a cadre of inquisitors empowered to investigate unapproved teachings, demanding that local clergy report any rumor of unorthodox gatherings. Yet inquisitors often lacked the theological training to distinguish genuine reform from simple criticism, further entrenching papal control over acceptable discourse. As these measures took hold, chronicles depicting early reformers were systematically rewritten to portray them as misguided zealots rather than earnest renovators. Over time, the memory of these alternative networks faded from ecclesiastical histories, resurfacing only in later polemical works and the rare notebooks of secret adherents. The result was a narrowing of acceptable theological debate, one enforced not only by ritual sanctions but by the careful curation and suppression of written records. In the autumn of 1140 CE, church leaders convened at the Council of Rheims to codify canon law in a collection that would later become the Decretum of Gratian. This undertaking marked a turning point. For the first time, papal decrees, conciliar canons, and writings of church fathers were systematically organized into a legal corpus. Yet the process was far from transparent. Manuscripts used by Gratian and his students often omitted conflicting regional statutes or glossed over provisions that limited papal reach. For example, early Lombard capitularies that protected local episcopal rights were frequently excluded, while Frankish royal charters empowering metropolitan oversight were given prominent placement. Clerical correspondence from the period indicates that certain diocesan synods petitioned to have their own disciplinary canons recognized, but were rebuffed by papal envoys who cited the burgeoning decretum's authority. Furthermore, Gratian students added marginal notes asserting that papal interpretations took precedence over any ambiguous clause, even when Gratian himself had maintained a more balanced stance. As a result, the emerging body of canon law subtly prioritized centralized papal jurisdiction, erasing the diversity of early medieval practice. This consolidation allowed popes to claim supreme judicial power in disputes among bishops, shaping a legal framework that extended Rome's influence into every corner of Western Christendom. By standardizing canon law in this way, the Church not only harmonized doctrine, but also cemented its temporal authority, ensuring that future generations would study a narrative of unified legal order rather than the patchwork of local traditions it supplanted. By the late 12th century, Venice had transformed its commercial wealth into repositories of knowledge that stood in stark contrast to Rome's hidden vaults. The arsenal's workshops produced not only ships, but also secure chests and cabinets, which the Republic used to safeguard valuable manuscripts and diplomatic correspondence. Venetian archives, housed in the Ducal Palace, contained treaties with the Byzantine Empire, records of trade agreements with Islamic states, and copies of scientific works translated from Arabic. Unlike the Vatican's subterranean storerooms, these documents were catalogued and accessible to a select group of civic officials and trusted scholars. In 1192 CE, the Great Council of Venice passed a decree allowing approved historians to consult the state archives under supervision, ensuring that public memory included the city's achievements rather than solely its economic prowess. Merchants preparing to depart on the Silk Road could reference navigational charts, astronomical tables, and medical treatises that the city had acquired through its Mediterranean networks. While Rome restricted access in the name of doctrinal integrity, Venice embraced the practical benefits of shared knowledge, recognizing that innovation in navigation and commerce relied on open exchange. Monastic communities in the Veneto region even deposited copies of their own illuminated chronicles in the civic libraries, signaling a willingness to collaborate with secular authorities. This openness fostered a spirit of inquiry that would later fuel the Venetian contributions to Renaissance humanism. By comparing the guarded secrecy of the Vatican's hidden vaults with the relative transparency of Venice's public archives, we see two models of memory shaped by competing priority of spiritual authority and commercial advancement, each leaving a distinct imprint on the historical record. Throughout the 11th and 12th centuries, the papal chancery refined its skill in drafting and amending documents to secure influence across Europe. In 1075 CE, Pope Gregory VII issued the Dictatus Papae, a collection of statements asserting papal supremacy over secular rulers. While the text itself was genuine, earlier bulls were retrospectively modified to align with its principles. For instance, a diploma granted by Pope Leo IX in 1053 CE originally conceded shared jurisdiction over ecclesiastical appointments with the Holy Roman Emperor. By the time Gratian's Decretum circulated in the mid-12th century, copies of this diploma had been subtly altered to emphasize exclusive papal rights, removing clauses that balanced imperial authority. Similar tampering occurred in 1155 CE, when Pope Adrian IV endorsed Frederick Barbarossa's coronation, and later scribes inserted additional privileges into the coronation decree, claiming imperial homage owed to the papacy. These forged extensions of power were easy to propagate because original documents were scarce and kept in secret archives. Even the papal ring seal, once a mark of authenticity, was occasionally replicated by overzealous curials seeking to curry favor with monarchs. It was not until legal scholars, such as John of Salisbury in the 1150s, began comparing multiple registers that discrepancies were noted. Yet by then, the revised versions had already become accepted precedent. This practice of deliberate alteration demonstrates how textual authority could be manufactured to serve shifting political aims, leaving modern historians to disentangle original intent from later interpolation. As we examine these cases, we see that the Vatican's mastery of documentary craft was as potent a tool as any military alliance in shaping medieval Christendom. In the summer of 567 CE, The bishops of Gaul gathered at the Council of Tours to address an unexpected surge of unregulated scriptural copies circulating among parish churches. Their canons demanded that only texts approved by metropolitan synods be copied, citing fears that unauthorized versions contained additions of man's imagination. Over subsequent councils, successive Gallic synods similarly restricted local scriptorium activity, ultimately relying on charters from Rome to enforce compliance. When Charlemagne revived the Council of Tours in 813 CE, he reaffirmed these measures, ordering bishops to destroy any uncatalogued scriptures found in their dioceses. Monastic records reveal that monks from Lisieux and Corbie complied by incinerating piles of old gospel scrolls and apocryphal fragments, often under the supervision of royal missi dominici. These efforts effectively centralized textual authority, ensuring that only the papal canon would inform doctrine and worship across the Frankish lands. By eliminating unauthorized copies, the Church not only controlled theological content, but also prevented the survival of regional variants, such as the Celtic Gospels with their distinctive prefatory materials and Ogham annotations. These local traditions, once integral to the faith of communities in Brittany and Ireland, were expunged from active use and relegated to memory, resurfacing only when later antiquarians unearthed neglected fragments centuries afterward. The Council of Tours thus stands as a pivotal moment when ecclesiastical unity was enforced through the deliberate pruning of divergent texts, shaping the medieval Christian imagination into a narrower channel defined by Rome's preferences. Let that one sink in. When you're ready for the next mystery, hit subscribe. Despite their significant contributions to early Christian thought, women's theological and scholarly voices were systematically effaced from the historical record during the Dark Ages. Figures such as Hypatia, whose mastery of mathematics and philosophy in Alexandria was celebrated in her lifetime, were posthumously cast as symbols of pagan decay, her works attributed to male contemporaries, or simply omitted from monastic libraries. Similarly, the prolific correspondence of women mystics like St. Hildegard of Bingen in the 12th century faced selective transmission. Her visionary writings were copied and canonized, yet her extensive medical recipes and natural lore, which blended scientific observation with spiritual insight, circulated only in a handful of manuscript fragments. In convents across Europe, abbesses maintained libraries that included both devotional texts and secular treatises, but inventory lists submitted to episcopal authorities often underreported these collections or classified them under generic headings. The marginal annotations of nuns commenting on biblical passages and offering original exegesis were regularly excised when texts were recopied in male-dominated scriptoria. Consequently, the intellectual labor of women was rendered invisible, their perspectives lost beneath layers of patriarchal editing. It was not until modern paleographers began examining palimpsested manuscripts that traces of women's scholarship resurfaced, names erased and overwritten, fragments of commentary squeezed into page corners, and coded references to female networks of learning. These discoveries challenge the simplistic narrative of a dark age, void by revealing the overlooked complexity of medieval thought. As we acknowledge the erasure of these women's voices, we are reminded that the construction of history often depends on which hands held the pennant whose words were deemed worth preserving. In the corridors of power within the Lateran Palace, rumors circulated of clandestine plots aimed at unseating uncooperative bishops. By the mid-11th century, papal records hint at secret missives dispatched under cowl to eliminate dissent. One such case involved Bishop Peter of Pavia, who in 1058 CE resisted directives to suppress regional liturgies. Shortly thereafter, anonymous letters accused him of simony and sacrilege. Within weeks, he was deposed by a synod packed with papal loyalists. Similar tactics surfaced in 1094 CE when Cardinal Humbert of Silva candidarescently returned from negotiations with Emperor Henry I, Pope Urban II, to convene a covert tribunal against an archbishop in Milan, leading to his swift arrest and exile. These maneuverings were rarely documented in official annals. Instead, they appear in marginal notes and private letters warning of invisible schemata beneath Rome's calm facade. Monks, sympathetic to ousted prelates, preserved personal testimonies in hidden notebooks, only for those diaries to be confiscated and burned upon discovery. Through these shadow campaigns, the Vatican enforced obedience not solely through doctrinal authority, but through calculated silencing of opposition. Such operations blurred the line between spiritual discipline and political assassination, leaving few overt traces, but reshaping episcopal leadership across Italy and Gaul. As modern historians sift through fragmented evidence, they uncover a pattern of covert influence that complemented the Church's more open assertions of power, revealing that the darkest cover-ups often occur not in the public eye, but in whispers and locked doors. In the year 597 CE, King Ethelbert of Kent took a momentous step by embracing the Christian faith, influenced by the mission of Augustine of Canterbury, whom Pope Gregory the Great had dispatched to convert the Anglo-Saxons. Yet the diplomatic choreography behind Ethelbert's baptism reveals a carefully managed narrative that served both royal ambition and papal interests. Contemporary Frankish and Roman sources commemorate the event as a spontaneous triumph of faith, yet correspondence preserved in the Gregorian registers hints at negotiations conducted in the corridors of power. Ethelbert agreed to support papal missions and grant land for new churches in exchange for spiritual legitimacy that would bolster his rule over rival chieftains. Papal letters instructed Augustine to portray the conversion not merely as a personal transformation, but as a divinely sanctioned alliance between Kent and Romea, portrayal that glossed over the complex interplay of local politics, Germanic customs, and lingering pagan practices. After the baptism, copies of Augustine's sermons were circulated with prefatory chapters emphasizing unity with the universal Church, while vernacular accounts that might have recorded dissent or syncretic rituals were excluded from liturgical texts. Archaeological excavations at Canterbury unearthed minor shrines and altars, suggesting that Christian and pagan worship coexisted for decades, yet these findings are absent from most ecclesiastical chronicles. By framing Ethelbert's adoption of Christianity as an immediate and thorough conversion, the Vatican crafted a seamless origin story for the English Church, one that reinforced papal influence, while obscuring the gradual, negotiated reality of religious change. Nestled in the rolling hills of Burgundy, the Abbey of Luxeuil, founded in the early 6th century by the Irish monk Columbanus, became a remarkable center of learning and spiritual innovation. Yet, beneath its celebrated reputation for monastic discipline, lay a network of clandestine translators and copyists who preserved secular texts alongside scriptural works. Under Abbot Waldebert in the mid-7th century, scribes at Luxeuil are believed to have rendered into Latin portions of Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy and early Irish treatises on natural science, works that conflicted with stricter Roman curricula. These translations circulated in hidden code, with marginal glosses in Old Irish indicating passages deemed too worldly for general use. When Frankish bishops visited to inspect the monastic library, the more controversial manuscripts were concealed in locked cupboards or misfiled among liturgical scrolls. A later inventory from 816 CE, created under pressure from the Carolingian reformers, lists only canonical works, omitting any hint of the abbey's broader intellectual endeavors. Yet fragments discovered in palimpsestes, overwritten with homilies, but revealing earlier philosophical dialogues, testify to Luxeu's role as a haven for non-theological learning. By safeguarding these secular texts in secrecy, the abbey helped transmit ideas that would later fuel the Carolingian Renaissance, even as official records sought to portray monastic scholarship as exclusively devoted to spiritual matters. In this way, Luxeuil exemplifies the hidden currents of medieval knowledge, where genuine curiosity persisted beneath layers of orthodoxy. In the tumultuous years following the collapse of Roman authority, the veneration of martyrs transformed from spontaneous local devotion into a finely tuned instrument of ecclesiastical power. Early communities often celebrated the burial places of martyrs with simple commemorations at roadside tombs. As bishops recognized the unifying potential of these cults, they began to orchestrate more elaborate festivals and processions, elevating certain figures to regional prominence. In the 4th and 5th centuries, the tomb of Saint Cecilia in Rome attracted pilgrims who sought healing and intercession. Local clergy seized on this popularity by commissioning grand basilicas and lavish iconography that reinforced the Church's spiritual and temporal authority. Meanwhile, the translation of relics, moving the physical remains of saints to new shrines, became a strategic act. When the bones of Saint Maurice and his Theban legion were brought from Egypt to Agaunum in present-day Switzerland around 380 CE, the local bishop declared that divine sanction rested with his see. Similar translations occurred across Gaul and Britain, each accompanied by rewritten passion narratives that amplified miracles and omitted any suggestion of clerical dispute or political rivalry. Hagiographers composed vitae that portrayed martyrs as paragons of faith, unblemished by worldly complexity, while any records of social unrest or pagan collaboration were quietly excised. By manufacturing consensus around these narratives, the Church could channel popular piety toward sites and celebrations under its control. The cult of the martyr thus became more than a spiritual practice. It served as a mechanism for consolidating episcopal influence, drawing tribute from pilgrims, and asserting doctrinal unity in an era of regional diversity. As modern scholars piece together fragmented liturgical calendars and rediscover suppressed accounts, the deliberate crafting of these cults reveals the Church's skill in shaping collective memory through the power of sanctified story. Pilgrimage routes first formalized in the 9th century carried more than devout travelers. They conveyed a carefully curated image of the Church itself. As early as 813 CE, Charlemagne's capitularies recognized the economic and spiritual importance of sites like Saint Denis near Paris and the shrine of St. James at Compostela in Galicia. Bishops and abbots collaborated with local rulers to promote specific pilgrimage destinations, commissioning miracle collections and liturgical texts that emphasized divine favor upon those locales. When the relics of Saint Swithun were translated to Winchester in 971 CE, the event was celebrated in verse and art, reinforcing Winchester's ecclesiastical prestige. Simultaneously, the Vatican issued decrees granting indulgences to pilgrims who visited well-publicized Roman churches, such as Santa Maria Maggiore, ensuring a steady flow of faithful and their offerings into the papal treasury. Monastic chroniclers produced travel guides, the Itineraria, detailing routes, safe lodgings, and the wonders pilgrims would witness. These guides often glossed over local unrest or banditry in favor of portraying the journey as a path of grace. In southern France, the town of Vézelay rose to prominence after its abbot publicized visions of Saint Mary, upon which Philippe Augustus based his crusade pledge in 1190 CE. effectively branding Vézelay as a gateway to both spiritual and military ventures. This synergy of faith and strategy reveals how pilgrimage became a vehicle for propaganda, shaping perceptions of holiness and drawing power towards sites endorsed by Rome. By guiding the faithful along selected paths and flooding certain shrines with mass narratives of miracles, the Church shaped a collective geography of devotion that aligned with its ecclesiastical and political interests. Long before modern intelligence agencies, the Church cultivated a network of informants to safeguard doctrinal purity and political interests. In the 10th century, papal envoys, known as legati, took on more than ceremonial roles. They gathered reports on the moral conduct of bishops, the theological leanings of local clergy, and the political machinations of secular princes. A surviving report from 962 CE notes that a legate in Bavaria sent coded dispatches about a count's suspected heretical sympathies, prompting Pope John XII to intervene discreetly. By the reign of Pope Gregory V, 996-999 CE, letters describe unnamed watchers embedded in monastic communities who monitored the circulation of forbidden texts and reported breaches directly to the Curia. These operatives also tracked the movements of relics, ensuring that unsanctioned translations did not undermine Roman authority. Under Pope Urban II, 1088-1099 CE, the network expanded to include former crusaders who relayed intelligence on Eastern rites and theological trends encountered in the Levant. Their observations informed the papal decrees that standardized liturgy and condemned practices deemed heretical abroad. Although these clandestine activities were justified as measures to protect the faithful, they also suppressed local autonomy and stifled intellectual exchange. The legati's hidden dossiers remained sealed in Vatican archives for centuries, leaving historians to reconstruct their scope from fragmentary correspondence. As we uncover the early roots of ecclesiastical surveillance, we see how information was wielded as power-shaping theological outcomes and reinforcing the Church's claim to universal oversight. The famed Abbey of Monte Cassino, founded by Benedict in 529 CE, stood as a beacon of monastic reform and learning in Italy. By the 10th century, however, it had also become a locus of doctrinal control. Records from 930 CE describe how abbots John and Richarius enforced censored library catalogues, purging any works with patristic debates deemed too controversial, particularly writings by Gregory of Nyssa and Origen, whose speculative theology clashed with growing Roman orthodoxy. Monks recall that texts on Eucharistic symbolism, once freely studied, were hidden behind locked iron gates, accessible only to those who swore additional oaths of secrecy. The abbey's famed manuscripts, including early commentaries on Augustine, bear telltale signs of later redaction. Entire glosses erased, passages whited out, and new marginal notes inserted to reframe contentious arguments in line with papal decrees. Meanwhile, the abbey's scriptorium produced lavish illuminated psalters, projecting an image of piety that masked a narrower intellectual horizon. When pilgrims visited to see Cassiodorus's preserved classical codices, they found only selective displays approved by successive abbots who reported directly to Rome. In this way, Monte Cassino exemplified the paradox of medieval scholarship, a site prided for its learning, yet complicit in the systematic narrowing of acceptable discourse. The cultural legacy of Europe's oldest Western abbey, therefore, is inseparable from the Church's broader project of controlling knowledge. A pause is good, but the secrets don't stop here. Subscribe and stay close. By the 11th century, the papal seal impressed in wax with the Pope's unique emblem served, not only as a mark of authenticity, but as an instrument of enforced confidentiality. Papal bulls and private letters, bound with a leaden bulla, carried instructions that recipients were forbidden to disclose. A letter from Pope Urban II in 1095 CE, commissioning the First Crusade, was sealed with explicit directives that its contents remain hidden until the appointed time. Its premature transmission by overzealous envoys forced the Pope to issue clarifications and reaffirm the secrecy of his strategic plans. Similarly, correspondence regarding contested ecclesiastical appointments, such as the disputed election of the Archbishop of Canterbury in 1070 CEs, routed through sealed missives to be opened only by designated envoys. Monastic chronicles occasionally lament the slow trickle of information, noting that entire months passed before chapters could respond to papal mandates locked behind multiple seals. The use of the bulla extended to pastoral letters containing sensitive doctrinal clarifications, ensuring that only vetted clergy could interpret evolving teachings. Over time, the papal chancery developed elaborate protocols. Letters were inscribed by chancery scribes, inspected by a master of petitioners, and finally sealed under the Pope's personal supervision. Any breach of these protocols was punishable by excommunication. This meticulous control over who could read and who could not reveals how the Church combined ritual ceremony with legal authority to manage not only its public pronouncements, but the very flow of information among its ranks. Throughout the 13th century, papal charters reshaped landholding patterns in ways that often went unremarked by contemporaries. When Pope Innocent III issued the Golden Bull of 1209, granting vast tracts of property to support the newly established mendicant orders, he simultaneously extinguished long-standing peasant rights to common pastures and woodlands. Local manorial rolls reveal that peasants who once grazed livestock freely were now subject to annual tithes owed directly to friaries in key urban centers. These charters were presented as acts of divine benevolence, endowing the Church with the means to care for the poor, yet the legal language conferred exclusive jurisdiction over disputes to ecclesiastical courts, negating traditional customary law. Subsequent bulls reaffirmed these privileges, often backdated to unchallenged earlier grants, making them appear long-standing. When villagers appealed to secular lords, they were rebuffed by decrees citing papal authority as superior to any temporal claim. Archival research in Toulouse and Bologna uncovers petitions from 1275 CE in which peasants pleaded for reinstatement of communal rights, only to have their records suppressed or lost amid administrative transfers. By leveraging charters cloaked in spiritual purpose, the papacy quietly consolidated its economic base, transforming local land use norms while keeping broader populations unaware of the legal subtleties behind these changes. In the early 5th century, Jerome of Stridon embarked on his monumental task of translating the Hebrew Bible into Latin, producing the Vulgata text destined to become the Western Church's standard scripture. Yet Jerome's translations reflect his own theological and cultural preoccupations, leading him to omit or alter passages that might complicate emerging Orthodox positions. His correspondence reveals debates over rendering specific Hebrew idioms that he feared would confound the faithful. For instance, in rendering Isaiah's prophecies, he smoothed over references to celestial hierarchies that he deemed speculative. Furthermore, Jerome chose to prioritize certain textual traditions over others, favoring the Greek Septuagint in books like Daniel and Esther, while in the Psalms he preferred an Old Latin version, reworking it with his characteristic verbosity. The result was a hybrid text that, while immensely influential, obscured the diversity of early biblical manuscripts. Later, Carolingian scholars seeking uniform liturgy across the empire adopted Jerome's Vulgate wholesale, despite occasional marginal notes questioning its consistency. When the Council of Trent in 1546 formally declared the Vulgate as the authoritative Latin text, these critical annotations were suppressed, and subsequent editions presented Jerome's work as monolithic. Only with modern textual criticism have scholars begun to discern the layers of revision within the Vulgate, recognizing Jerome's role not merely as translator but as editor shaping sacred history. As we reflect on the lasting impact of his choices, we confront the enduring tension between textual fidelity and doctrinal unity, a balance the Church has negotiated and sometimes tipped for centuries. In the 10th century, as the schism between East and West deepened, behind-the-scenes diplomacy between Rome and Constantinople took on a more clandestine character than official records suggest. While the Photian Schism of 863 CE and its resolution in 867 CE are well documented in councils and letters, lower-level envoys carried secret missives outlining theological compromises and power-sharing arrangements that were never ratified publicly. One such letter, preserved in a private archive until its rediscovery in the 19th century, reveals that Emperor Basil I offered to recognize papal primacy in the West in exchange for marginal autonomy for the Patriarch of Constantinople. In return, Pope Nicholas I promised discreet support for Byzantine claims in southern Italy. These negotiations unfolded through ciphered dispatches delivered by merchants who blended into Genoese fleets, ensuring that only intended recipients could decode their contents. Meanwhile, chroniclers in both capitals omitted these secret understandings, portraying official ruptures as total breakdowns of communion. The result was a public facade of doctrinal hostility, even as practical cooperation continued in trade, crusading efforts, and cultural exchange. This dual narrative allowed both churches to maintain hardline stances before their constituencies while quietly averting mutual isolation. Later, historians, reliant on public decrees and polemical tracts, missed these nuances, framing the East-West divide as an inevitable clash rather than a series of negotiated truces. As modern scholars uncover these covert correspondences, we gain a richer picture of medieval geopolitics zone, where theological disputes interwove with realpolitik, and where the Vatican's greatest cover-ups were not only of doctrinal dissent, but also of pivotal alliances hidden from public view. By the mid-9th century, monastic vows of silence had evolved into formalized oaths, binding monks to confidentiality regarding internal ecclesiastical matters. These vows, originally intended to foster spiritual discipline, became tools for preserving institutional secrecy. At the Synod of Mainz in 847 CE, a canon was introduced, mandating that any monk privy to private chapters, those confidential meetings where abbots and bishops discussed sensitive issues, could face expulsion for unauthorized disclosure. Such chapters addressed everything from the handling of relic allegations to disputes over benefactor donations, but their proceedings rarely appeared in official annals. In 873 CE, a chronicler at Fulda recorded that the abbot invoked these oaths when silencing a monk who threatened to expose financial irregularities. Similarly, correspondence from the Benedictine Abbey of St. Gall mentions sworn affidavits taken from scribes to prevent leaks about forbidden texts and doctrinal debates. The enforcement of these vows extended beyond individual monasteries. Papal decrees in the 10th century reaffirmed the sanctity of monastic confidentiality, warning that revelations could undermine the Church's unity. Over time, the culture of secrecy fostered an environment where scandals and internal disagreements were hidden rather than addressed, reinforcing the Vatican's ability to present a unified front. As we examine these silent walls and the solemn promises binding those within, We confront the paradox of a faith that prized openness with the divine yet cloaked its earthly affairs in silence. In the winter of 476 CE, as the last Roman emperor faded into exile, the term Dark Ages had yet to be coined indeed. It would not emerge in intellectual circles until the Renaissance. Yet in the 9th century, theorists like Petrarch would later cast the centuries following Rome's fall as a time of spiritual and cultural obscurity. Behind this retrospective label, it was the Church that shaped the narrative through selective historiography. Early medieval annalists framed events to emphasize the Church's role as the sole beacon of light amid barbarian chaos, downplaying periods of artistic and scientific innovation that flourished under isolated courts and monastic enclaves. Chronicles such as the Annals of Lorsch meticulously recorded papal successes while omitting references to regional art schools in Aachen and Hiberno-Saxon metalwork. In correspondence to Archbishop Hincmar of Reims, King Charles the Bald in 861 CE lamented that secular poets and astronomers were dismissed as pagan relics, their contributions unworthy of Christian memory. Meanwhile, the Church's own synods maintained a steady stream of letters extolling the moral darkness of non-Christian lands, reinforcing the sense of Europe plunged into spiritual night. Yet archaeological discoveries in Viking Greenland, Andalusian Spain, and Byzantine Sicily reveal networks of trade, literacy, and artistic exchange that belie the notion of universal decline. These complexities were scrubbed from many ecclesiastical histories, replaced with a simplified arc from pagan ruin to Christian redemption. As we reclaim the richness hidden behind the Dark Ages label, we challenge the Church's long-held monopoly on defining the past and open the door to a more nuanced understanding of a time once deemed irredeemably dark. In the court of Charlemagne, literacy and learning experienced an unprecedented revival, and at its heart stood Angilbert, the king's trusted advisor and poet. Though officially remembered for composing verses in praise of imperial majesty, his extensive correspondence with ecclesiastical leaders reveals a subtler influence. He regularly furnished Carolingian scriptoria with annotated manuscripts drawn from his personal collection, selecting works that aligned with royal policy. Angelbert's letters to Bishop Theodulf of Orleans preserved, in fragments of the Epistolae Carolini Aevi, outline instructions for enhancing hagiographical texts with laudatory passages extolling Charlemagne's piety and military successes. He advised the removal of prophecies or miracle accounts that might imply divine disfavor toward the emperor's campaigns, ensuring that saints' legends served as endorsement rather than critique. His patronage also extended to the circulation of Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy, which he underscored as a moral exemplar for court officials, while cautioning against the dissemination of Cicero's Republican treatises, perceived as dangerous to imperial cohesion. Through these curated interventions, Angilbert shaped not only the intellectual content, but the ideological slant of the Carolingian Renaissance. His dual role as poet and political operative exemplifies how lay figures within the Church's orbit exercised covert editorial power, guiding the texts that would inform European scholarship for generations. As we examine his surviving letters and the manuscripts they influenced, we uncover the delicate collaboration between crown and church, inscripting a narrative of Christian Empire Rome that still echoes in our understanding of medieval authority. In the late 10th century, the sacrament of penance became a tool not only for spiritual reconciliation, but also for political leverage among the European elite. When nobles found themselves at odds with the crown or with rival lords, they were often required to perform public acts of contrition processions through cathedrals, donations of lands or treasures to monasteries, and symbolic scourging to regain favor both with earthly authorities and with the Church. The records of the Council of Mainz in 975 CE note that Duke Henry of Bavaria was compelled to seek absolution before the archbishop, offering vast tracts of land that would come under ecclesiastical control. Chroniclers celebrated these scenes as demonstrations of piety overcoming pride. Yet private correspondence between bishops and the papal curia reveals a more strategic dimension. Bishops used penance as a way to extract resources and to bind powerful families to Rome's interests. Penitential manuals, which emerged in monastic scriptoria during this era, listed prescribed acts donation of livestock, pilgrimages to distant shrines, fasting on specific days that aligned with the Church's fiscal and territorial ambitions. Clerics instructed penitent nobles to support favored abbeys, ensuring a flow of wealth into institutions loyal to the papacy. In some cases, when a reconciliation failed to yield the desired outcomes, ecclesiastical courts threatened excommunication, effectively removing a noble's right to govern until they complied with church dictates. By intertwining penance with property transfers and public ceremonies, the Church shaped the governing elite's relationship to faith and power. The politics of penance thus became an instrument of both moral authority and temporal influence, engraving Rome's prerogatives on the landscape of medieval Europe. In 1204 CE, when crusading armies besieged Constantinople, their soldiers wielded more than swords and siege engines. They carried papal mandates that framed the assault as an act of holy necessity. The Fourth Crusade's original goal to liberate Jerusalem's shifted dramatically under Venetian and papal pressure toward the Byzantine capital, a Christian city deemed corrupt and in need of reform. Pope Innocent III's letters authorized financial support and indulgences for those who joined the diverted campaign, granting divine remission for both regions' inhabitants. Chroniclers in the West portrayed the siege as a necessary purge of schismatics, yet few mentioned that many crusaders had no combat experience and were motivated more by profit than piety. As towers fell and relics were looted, papal representatives on the ground negotiated terms with crusader leaders to preserve certain churches and monastery agreements, often broken once the city fell. The Church's ability to sanction violence against fellow Christians exemplified how doctrinal authority could justify territorial conquest. In the aftermath, Rome issued bulls condemning the desecration of sacred sites, even as it accepted the new Latin hierarchy installed in Constantinople, thereby profiting from offices and tithes that flowed into the papal treasury. Through these actions, the Vatican demonstrated that theological justification could not only endorse war, but also reshape ecclesiastical structures for political and economic gain. Modern assessments of the Fourth Crusade have condemned its moral contradictions, yet they must also reckon with the Church's active role in scripting a narrative that cloaked avarice in the language of salvation. Beneath the hustle of Rome's streets lay a network of covert courier lines, known as cursus secretus, dedicated to transporting sensitive documents beyond prying eyes. By the mid-13th century, the papal court had formalized this system, employing relay stations at fortified posts spaced along the Via Francigena and other key routes. Riders carried leather pouches sealed with the Pope's bulla, ensuring that no statute or diplomatic correspondence could be opened before reaching its designated addressee. These couriers traveled by night when roads were less patrolled, relying on coded signposts and secret passwords passed down orally to bypass bandits and inquisitive magistrates. Chronicles from the Abbey of Farfa recount that in 1264 CE, a batch of letters containing instructions for the conclave electing Pope Clement IV was rerouted through Tuscan villages under threat of interception by imperial agents. Similar precautions guarded treaties between the Vatican and the Kingdom of Sicily, where disputes over church benefices could inflame regional tensions. The existence of this shadow postal network allowed the papacy to coordinate intrigue, finance military ventures, and manage ecclesiastical appointments with a level of discretion unmatched by contemporary monarchs. While public highways bore the traffic of pilgrims and merchants, the secret roads of the Vatican carried the lifeblood of its temporal ambitions documents that shaped European politics in ways never disclosed in official annals. In the shadowed recesses of the Vatican's manuscript, vaults lay a text long whispered about but seldom acknowledged, the so-called Gospel of Venus. Crafted by an obscure priest in 4th century Antioch, it celebrated pre-Christian rites of love and fertility, drawing parallels between the pagan goddess and early Marian devotion. Though never recognized by any council, the gospel circulated quietly among ascetic communities who interpreted its allegories as metaphors for divine grace. By the early 6th century, when Pope Gelasius I asserted strict boundaries between acceptable scripture and heretical writings, this work was condemned as a poisoned chalice and ordered removed from monastic libraries. Surviving references in clerical correspondence allude to its destruction in Rome around 496 CE, yet tantalizing fragments endured in palimpsests at coastal abbeys, hidden under layers of homilies and canonical commentaries. In the 13th century, inquisitors searching for Cathar scriptures stumbled upon faint traces of its distinctive poetic meter in the margins of an otherwise unremarkable sacramentary, prompting renewed efforts to suppress any mention of its existence. Despite such measures, passages survived in vernacular retellings among Renaissance humanists who prized ancient lore, and these were later collected by antiquarians eager to reconstruct lost Christian apocrypha. When scholars in the 19th century employed multispectral imaging on Vatican fragments, they recovered lines celebrating love as a divine force equal to judgment, challenging long-held assumptions about the early Church's theological boundaries. The Gospel of Venus thus stands as a testament to the Vatican's enduring struggle to define orthodoxy, by exclusion reminding us that some of the most provocative voices in Church history were those the institution most zealously sought to erase. In the upheaval following the Reconquista's early campaigns, Spanish monasteries became repositories for a vast array of Islamic manuscripts, philosophical treatises, medical compendia, mathematical works, and ornate Quranic calligraphy. Yet, as the 12th century progressed, church councils and royal edicts combined to curb this cultural exchange. In 1179 CE, the Third Lateran Council's canons under Pope Alexander III expressly barred the possession of Saracen books without explicit episcopal permission. Monastic librarians in Toledo and Salamancons, famed for their translation schools, were compelled to surrender non-Christian texts to cathedral chapters. Those deemed heretical or superstitious were publicly burned in the Plaza Mayor, their ashes scattered into the Tagus. More useful works, particularly on astronomy and medicine, were secretly retained in hidden cellars, their Arabic script painstakingly catalogued under cryptic labels. Scholars like Gerard of Cremona continued translating texts such as Ptolemy's Almagest and Avicenna's Canon of Medicine, but did so under papal sanction and with heavy Christian commentary that reframed their insights within a theological context. Despite these constraints, a covert community of translators and scholars preserved and circulated Arabic thought, often embedding marginal Latin notes to mask original attributions. Their work laid the groundwork for the later spread of European universities, Yet the deliberate excision of pure Islamic voices from public collections underscored the Church's intent to control the narrative of knowledge. By mediating, and at times obstructing this intellectual flow, the Vatican shaped Western scholarship into a mosaic of adapted wisdom rather than a direct continuation of its Arabic sources. As medieval scholars looked skyward for answers about fate and providence, the Church cast a wary eye on astrology, deeming it a gateway to heretical determinism. In the early 10th century, synods such as those convened at Mainz in 923 CE issued canons banning clergy from consulting star books or horoscopes, instructing that any parchment-bearing planetary charts be surrendered to episcopal authorities. Monastic libraries complied by ripping out tables of planetary hours from medical and agricultural treatises, often pasting over the missing sections with sermons on divine sovereignty. At Rheims in 1049 CE, Bishop Raban recorded the destruction of a lavishly illustrated codex of Ptolemy's Tetrabiblosites vellum pages, heaped in a clandestine bonfire behind the cathedral. Yet fragments of astrolabes and fragments of Arabic Latin astronomy manuals survived in private hands. Noble patrons commissioned hidden observatories where lay scholars refined eclipses and planetary conjunctions away from inquisitive clerics. By the 13th century, Thomas Aquinas would argue that celestial influences could affect the body but never the sola theological compromise that permitted limited study of the heavens while affirming divine free will. Nonetheless, treatises on comets and eclipses remain chained in select cathedral schools, accessible only to those with explicit scholarly licenses from the papal chancery. The result was a cautious integration of astronomical knowledge into Christian cosmology, one filtered through doctrinal concerns and ecclesiastical oversight. As modern historians reconstruct lost star lore from marginal annotations and surviving astrolabe fragments, they reveal an uneasy balance. A church determined to uphold spiritual authority even as it preserved the glimmers of cosmic curiosity. In the spring of 716 CE, the Lombard king Liutprand negotiated a secret pact with Pope Gregory II that reshaped the political landscape of northern Italy. While public charters recorded only mutual non-aggression, surviving fragments of private letters preserved in a crypt beneath Brescia Cathedral reveal terms far more consequential. Liutprand agreed to relinquish claims on papal estates in exchange for military support against rebellious dukes, effectively granting the Vatican de facto feudal overlordship of territories around Sutri and Viterbo. In return, the Pope pledged ecclesiastical endorsement of Liutprand's authority, strengthening his claim to kingship among Lombard nobles who prized religious legitimacy. These clandestine negotiations bypassed the Byzantine exarch in Ravenna, undermining Eastern influence without any formal declaration of schism. Public records, curated by papal archivists, omitted references to Byzantine titulature and emphasized the Pope's role as a spiritual mediator, masking the transaction's strategic depth. Only centuries later did a copy of the original Lombard annals surface, its annotations hinting at undisclosed land grants and secret fealty oaths sworn on relics of St. Peter. By orchestrating this covert accommodation, the Vatican entrenched its temporal power in central Italy, setting a precedent for future papal-secular alliances. As modern historians piece together these hidden treaties, we uncover how the Church's greatest cover-ups were not solely of heresy or doctrine, but of formidable political bargains that forged the medieval papal states. Rest your mind, you've earned it. But when the next veil lifts, be here, subscribe. In the shadowed corridors of the Lateran Palace, whispers spoke of poisoners employed to remove inconvenient rivals under the guise of natural causes. During the pontificate of Pope John XXII, in the early 14th century. Death certificates for several high-ranking curial officials cited sudden fevers and mysterious convulsions, yet private correspondence hints at darker interventions. A clerk's diary from 1320 CE records that 2 papal chamberlains fell ill after dining at the same banquet and died within days amid baffling symptoms. Suspicion fell upon a nun in charge of the papal kitchens, reputed to deliver subtly laced meals to men whose puritanical stances threatened the Pope's financial interests. Although no formal inquiry was ever recorded, later accounts by chroniclers such as Giovanni Villani recount that Pope John the 2012 rewarded confidants with lucrative benefices once these chamberlains were gone. Similar incidents occurred under Pope Boniface VIII at the turn of the century, when a cardinal opposed to the Pope's claim of temporal supremacy over France died suddenly. While traveling to a council, he collapsed after receiving a consecrated chalice said to be tampered with. Official annals attributed these deaths to divine judgment or sudden illness, but private letters between French royal envoys and the Vatican speak of fear and caution, with orders for additional guards and food tasters for visiting dignitaries. These episodes reveal how lethal subterfuge could serve political ends, carried out under the cloak of ecclesiastical ritual and secrecy. As we contemplate the murky blend of faith, power, and clandestine murder, we confront an unsettling truth. Even within the sanctity of the papal household, the struggle for authority sometimes played out in the quiet administration of poison rather than in the spectacle of synods. In the mid-12th century, a network of skilled forgers operated within and around the Vatican, producing altered genealogies and fabricated chronicles to serve Rome's political and ecclesiastical agendas. One striking example involves the lineage of the Counts of Tusculum, a powerful Roman family whose early support of successive popes culminated in multiple pontificates. Original deeds from the 10th century granted them modest lands in exchange for military aid. Yet, by the reign of Pope Urban II, 1088-1099 CE, forged documents circulated that extended Tusculan estates deep into the Sabine Hills. These counterfeit charters bore the seal of earlier papacials that were expertly replicated by curial artisans familiar with chancery techniques. When challenged by neighboring lords, papal legates insisted on the authenticity of these records and likely suppressed any original deeds that contradicted them. Similarly, the Liber Pontificalis, the official record of papal biographies, underwent surreptitious revisions in the 13th century to insert favorable anecdotes about Gregory VII's confrontations with Emperor Henry IV, embellishing his excommunication power and downplaying the emperor's subsequent penitent procession at Canossa in 1077 CE. Monastic chroniclers, who preserved earlier versions, found their manuscripts repurposed for binding, their parchment reused for newer, corrected editions. It was not until humanist scholars of the Renaissance rediscovered older codices in peripheral monasteries that discrepancies surfaced, revealing layers of interpolation and omission. These forgeries demonstrate how the Vatican's control over documentary traditions could rewrite noble lineages and papal legacies, alike shaping both temporal authority and sacred history through the strategic manipulation of ink and parchment. Deep beneath St. Peter's Basilica lies the 11th century crypt known as the Sacrarium Muris, where select clergy conducted unsanctioned liturgies that diverged from official Roman rites. Excavations in 1,965 uncovered faded frescoes depicting ritual scenes absent from mainstream martyrology's figures, invoking saints outside the canonical roster, and prayers appealing for revelations rather than intercession. These subterranean chapels existed alongside the revered public basilicas, yet their activities were never recorded in Vatican registers. A 10th century guide for novice initiates, preserved in a private family archive until its sale in the 18th century, instructed newcomers to speak only in whispered tones and to leave all official documents in locked chests above ground. When papal authorities learned of these hidden ceremonies often tied to mystical fraternities seeking direct communion with the divine, they dispatched legates to dismantle the chapels, ordering the reconsecration of the space for standard liturgy. Accounts of these suppressions survive only in marginal comments within the diaries of pilgrims who inadvertently stumbled upon them. The Church's blanket silence on the Sacrarium Muris allowed it to preserve a uniform image of worship, masking the vibrant heterodoxy that pulsed beneath its foundations. As modern researchers decipher the crypt's archaic iconography and reconstruct its forbidden liturgies, they reveal a chapter of Christian ritual practice that the Vatican intentionally buried both in stone and in silence. By the mid-12th century, a quiet revolution began as reformist movements emerged from within monastic orders, challenging the strictures that had long governed church life. The Humiliati in Lombardy, for example, formed lay fraternities devoted to apostolic poverty and communal labor, preaching sermons on social justice outside the formal hierarchy. Their manuscripts, collections of ethical treatises and lay catechisms, were circulated discreetly among urban artisans and merchants. However, in 1184 CE, Pope Lucius III issued the Decretal ad abolendum to condemn false brethren, explicitly targeting these groups for promoting unauthorized teachings. Monastic archives note that the Humiliati's writings were seized and burned, their leaders excommunicated unless they renounced lay preaching. Similarly, the Petrobrucian movement in Toulouse, led by Peter of Bruges, advocated for simpler worship and criticized clerical wealth. Its vernacular sermons, written in Occitan, were proscribed at the Council of Toulouse in 1119 CE, and any copies were ordered destroyed. Yet, fragments of their texts survived in hidden collections of sympathetic bishops who argued that such reform was rooted in early Christian tradition. When Bernard of Clairvaux denounced these movements in his On the Errors of the Lombards, he used language echoing earlier synodal condemnations, blending theological critique with appeals to social order. Over time, the official narrative painted reformers as schismatics rather than renewal agents. Their suppression underscores the Vatican's wariness of grassroots, calls for change, and highlights how genuine reform efforts were silenced to preserve centralized authority. In 1215 CE, the Fourth Lateran Council under Pope Innocent III codified numerous reforms aimed at curbing abuses and clarifying doctrine. But it also marked the beginning of cracks in the Vatican's informational stranglehold. Latin scholars like Joachim of Fiore proposed new eschatological visions that diverged from official teaching, suggesting a coming age of the Spirit characterized by direct divine revelation. His writings, circulated in manuscript among Cistercian monasteries, suppressed any mention of strict hierarchical mediation of sacred knowledge. While Innocent's legates initially permitted these texts under the guise of theological inquiry, by 1229 CE, the Council of Toulouse moved to ban Joachim's more radical works, ordering their destruction alongside Cathar and Waldensian treatises. Yet these prohibitions could not extinguish the underlying currents of reform. Copies continued to be hidden in abbey cellars and private libraries, passed from hand to hand with coded marginalia. At the same time, university masters at Paris and Bologna began teaching canon law and theology with an unprecedented degree of academic freedom, challenging the monopoly of the papal curia. Their lecture notes, once deemed too contentious for circulation, became the basis of a growing body of scholastic commentary that broadened interpretive possibilities. Though the Vatican responded with measures to license and surveil emerging academic guilds, it could not fully contain the ferment of ideas unleashed by these reformist and scholarly movements. The struggle between centralized doctrinal control and intellectual innovation culminated in a more pluralistic, theological landscape that the Church would continue to manage but no longer monopolize. In the early 15th century, Renaissance humanists began to unearth and question the received wisdom of medieval Christendom, challenging the very foundation of the Dark Ages narrative. Scholars such as Petrarch, in the mid-1300s, lamented the centuries of cultural decline following Rome's fall. Yet he also rediscovered classical letters in monastic libraries, long neglected by the Vatican's custodians. When Poggio Bracciolini, acting as a papal scribe under John XXII in 1417 CE, recovered Lucretius's De Rerum Natura from a German monastery, he exposed that church scholars had allowed priceless pagan texts to languish in obscurity. His triumphant letters to Rome praised the wonder of a rediscovered epic, but they also noted how difficult it was to persuade curial authorities to preserve such works once their subversive content-materialist philosophy, atomistic theory, became apparent. Concurrently, the invention of the printing press around 1440 CE revolutionized the production of books, threatening the Vatican's centuries-old scriptoria monopoly. Early editions of Augustine and Aquinas printed in Mainz bypassed papal approval entirely, flooding Europe with texts that had previously been confined to hidden vaults. Attempts by church officials to impose censorship through the Index Librorum Prohibitorum in the 16th century could not stem the tide of printed knowledge. As the boundaries between secular and sacred learning blurred, the Dark Ages label itself fell into disrepute, replaced by a view of medieval Europe as a complex tapestry of ignorance and innovation. The lasting legacy of these transformations lies in the recognition that history is not merely preserved, but continually reclaimed. Its cover-ups eventually uncovered by those bold enough to seek the truths buried beneath centuries of curated silence. That was one layer. Take a moment, then subscribe, and we'll go deeper next time. Hey there! Thank you for journeying through centuries of hidden histories with me. Tonight, we've traced the Vatican's role in shaping what we remember and what we forget about the so-called Dark Ages. From secret synods in catacombs to cloistered scriptoria, we've seen how power, piety, and politics wove a tapestry of both light and shadow across medieval Europe. If you found this exploration illuminating, feel free to like and subscribe only if you genuinely enjoyed the story. I'd love to know where you're watching from and what time it is where you are, so drop a comment below and join our global conversation. Now, dim the lights, let a soft hush settle in the room, and settle in for a tale that challenges everything you thought you knew about history.